All right, I guess I'll host again. What do you think?
I got some good compliments last time.
Oh, did you? No. What is up with everybody talking to you about the pod? No one says anything to me about it. Do you go around asking?
Yeah, I say, are you listening to the podcast? How did I do? Good. No, I talked a lot about it to a few people at the Cultivate conference. We were sitting in the back.
Oh, fun.
So, yeah, it's fun. They were like, they said it seems like there's like a meta element to whatever this is. And it seems like we're doing a little bit of a bit the whole time.
Yes.
But I don't know what the bit is. I don't know what. Someone said it's fun to watch me try my hardest to not make this like a normal podcast or like feel like or something. They said something like.
Well, you're always trying to say like you can cut this out. Like you try to make it where I get nervous that we're posting this.
Yeah. Get in your head.
Yeah. Little do they know this is how we always interact.
Well, I think we have a lot of conversations that like outside of podcasting where we're like, oh, that should have been a podcast.
True.
But there's a pressure that I feel when we're in this environment to hit the time and to not speak too slowly and to get through all of the content within the allotted time. And I can feel your anxiety the longer that I start to talk and the more that I ramble. And so that pushes me it just kind of does something to my brain. So
one conversation we did have at the beginning of this year that I think would be really fun on a podcast is when we talked about communication. Remember that? Just the art of communicating and teaching and theories that we had.
Oh, at Portillo's?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was like, that should have been a podcast. So comment below, communication, if you want us to have that episode.
But that was so off the cuff. Like, I don't remember what
It'd be hard to fabricate.
Yeah.
We have talked about making another communication workshop where I want to do workshops again.
Well, they're fun in the summer. Well, but also in the summers before, we haven't had a ton to do in the past, and I think we have more to do now. But it was really discouraging, I think, to put all that work in and then to not have many
15 people show up.
Yeah.
That's true. I think we would have, that's probably what made us stop, was just like the attendance.
Yeah.
We were so proud of the content.
It was, it was good stuff.
It was
good
stuff.
But remember, we used to go all out. We would do the tables and the lights. Like, we would spend all morning, like, stringing lights together. And it was a huge, like, that was almost like one of the biggest events that we did at our church. And then we don't do them anymore.
Well, two things on it. One, it was to develop leaders. So we weren't making a wide net for it.
Yeah.
Two was... we did it over the summer, and people have vacations. Yeah. So then it just became, I missed one. And I think we always designed it where they stacked. So it's like if you miss one, you're kind of going to feel left out.
Yeah.
Like you won't understand the next one. But we've done all sorts of workshops, outreach workshops, church history, Christian theology, communication, leadership.
How to read the Bible. Vocation. I always forget about the workplace
workshop.
We did like a 3-week thing on. Yeah.
That was fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, here we are. Too busy.
I guess.
Fasting, episode 4. We are rounding out this talk. Now, Lord willing, we will begin to hear from stories from people like you at our church of how this fasting practice has shaped their life. And I really didn't want to discourage people, but on Sunday I was essentially saying, based off our study in Isaiah 58, hey, these 3 weeks have been awesome, but if we just stay there, the Lord's kind of like, hey, my voice won't be heard on high. Now, it feels a bit dramatic, and I do think, and let me just say, I think there's progressions. I think this doesn't discount what has happened those first 3 weeks, but at some point we have to get honest and see. Isaiah 58 is saying, if you fast in such a way that you're not loving your neighbor, you're not actually loving your God like you think you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was tough. How did you feel about it?
Why do you ask? Was a stinker? Is that what you're saying?
No, it was good. I just remember you said you were a little nervous.
I was dramatic and posted all week about how, I posted one post, but everybody saw it. You know, on Instagram stories, like you see how many people see?
Yeah.
Here's what I've learned. When I do like a video story, it's like 150 people. Mm-hmm. When I just do like a words, it's like 500. Mm-hmm. So that one was 500 people saw it. Like 25 people liked, 30 people commented, I've been there. Or other people in our church were saying, oh man, should we go this Sunday? Like just messing with me.
Yeah.
So I shouldn't have done that, drawn attention to that. But no, I think the Lord was honored, and that's all that mattered. It's just like it's a tone thing. Mm-hmm. We were talking about it. I did learn in college that you are supposed to match the tone of the text. And so this is obviously not like all super happy. Ricky, he sent me a video of David Wilkerson, the prayer of anguish or the gift of anguish or the burden of anguish, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a classic. He's in Times Square Church, right?
I think so, yeah.
You can totally tell. So we went to Altars Conference in New York, you and I and my wife. You could totally tell John Tyson is influenced by this guy.
Yeah.
So much of it was like, oh, that's a lot of the heartbeat of our sermon Sunday, but he was a lot more harsh.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh, okay. I took a lot of the edge off. He was like, are you watching HBO? Repent. It was pretty hardcore.
Yeah, there's something about that. I think that it's tough because of what you named, the Francis Schaeffer quote about America. Our life in the suburb is so detached in one sense from the reality of suffering of people across the world or even in our neighborhoods across the streets. At the same time, I think the Isaiah passage is so convicting because the people weren't like that's just a feature of the human condition, is to focus inward and to be concerned about our own prosperity, our own self-righteousness, and to make our spiritual formation a means to that end, to those ends. And Isaiah 58 is God speaking to Isaiah, and then Isaiah speaking to the people, calling that out. And I think what you see in the Old Testament is the constant, it's like the constant recurring failure of the Israelites, of God's chosen people, was idolatry. But there is like, you can't ignore the connection between their idolatry and their role as like oppressors and people who neglect those around them. And I think like their purpose was to ultimately be a light to the nations around them. And they kind of took that chosen people persona and turned it inward. And that's what fueled their idolatry, and that kind of kept them in that cycle. And so for just as many critiques as there are about them abandoning Yahweh to worship other gods, I think there are as many critiques about them neglecting the poor and the needy and forgetting their original purpose, which is to be a light and bring others into relationship with Yahweh.
Yeah, and I think there's so many multi-layers to contending for our neighbors. And like, I want to primarily think in the context, and I don't think this is wrong, to think about those who are lost. So those who are far from God, that's what our hearts should really break for. But you also can't escape the prophets and the New Testament saying, and also literally the poor, literally those who are least among us. And so that's where I was most convicted, because as I studied this practice, and I've, again, done fasting fairly consistently since like 2018, but the idea of fasting and taking that money and giving it to the poor is something I felt like I had to preach on, because it was something that church history seems to clearly have done. But it's like, I can't speak from authority or integrity that I have this long runway of doing that myself. So I think it's also part of the uncomfortability. And also just, I was thinking about it again, and I remember in junior high, I would like be weeping over the state of people's souls. And there's just something that happens, and it's probably the third soil, the worries of this age, the deceitfulness of wealth, the desires for other things, or like it's uncomfortable to be uncomfortable. So like we just go to the comforts and conveniences of life to finally just take the edge off and just like, it's like I'm weeping again, So that's why we said this again last week, but sometimes revival doesn't sustain because we're like, God, we've had enough, He doesn't like over intrude, because living in that revival, living for the sake of other souls, what a joy. But also there's obviously a burden, which is why we said, hey, pray for that agony.
Yeah, the agony thing's really interesting, because it's such a weird thing to pray for. It's like praying for pain. And I think that there's there's a lot. Like when you're in high school or junior high or whatever, like you're just not as responsible for as many parts of your life. So you kind of have just the flexibility, the free time, your mind goes there. And
true.
I think God has more access to your heart in moments like that and seasons like that. And so it is a fight to give God those parts of your heart, the older that you get and the more responsibilities you have. And so I don't think like this was necessarily a like condemning.
Right. It's
teaching.
Not a guilt trip. Guilt trips don't work.
Right.
And this is an invitation, and that's something I didn't say. This is still all invitation.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is the invitation thing can only carry you so far, because at some point it's like, well, if you're going to take the invitation, here's what it really means.
Sure.
Like, take up your cross. It's not an invitation to an easy life. It's an invitation to like suffering and to agony for the lost and for those in need and things like that. So yeah, agony is tough. I think feeling the burden like is something that can happen if you pray for it. I thought that was a great point, that it too often we wait for that to happen naturally. Why are you smiling?
Nothing.
Okay. You talked about that, right?
Yeah, you said it's a great point. It's the point you told me to make.
No,
it's great. Yeah, I wasn't gonna. Sorry, I smiled.
Oh no, you're good. I thought I was saying something wrong.
No.
Oh.
You were like, you had really good perspective, because I was like, if we want to begin to contend, move from sympathy to agony, you're like, what if we said ask God to move from? And I was like, that's such a good point, because that's
Gotcha.
really what we're inviting God to do.
Yeah, I remember. I think there's a lot of pushback. Like this would be the pushback I have, which is like, well, I'll pray for that when I feel like it, but right now I'm really feeling a need to just pray for myself. And so like, if you live life that way, you're never going to develop that. But I think God will, if you want it, God will give that burden to you. And I think that's a really hard thing to carry, but it does kind of push you outside of like yourself, and it allows you to experience God's love for you and for others in a way that you wouldn't otherwise, aside from that like pain, which it is like it is. I think we experienced some of that at like the Altars Conference, people who like really live a life of burden that I don't have. And seeing that from another perspective, from an outside perspective, seeing what it looks like for somebody to live out Isaiah 58, where they are just groaning and praying out for God to heal and for God to come and do what he's done in the past, is like it very much is a burden.
Even what they were saying, to add grace to this whole conversation, in New York, they were talking about how it first started with just intimacy. It first started with just falling in love with him, needing to spend time with him on walks. And then there was a turning point where it's like, okay, will you travail? Will you weep in agony? Looking at the text and Jesus walking into Jerusalem, and he wept over the city, because he's like, if only I could be like the mother hen to bring them in, So I think there has to be grace here, where when we talk about these series or these practices in 4 weeks, we're always saying this is like a template-ish, but we're not expecting you to figure all this out in 4 weeks. That's why we're going to keep talking about it for the next 8, like specifically, but also still having it within the life of our conversations. We're hoping this is well beyond even this year of us kind of taking that journey, but we always at the same time go, don't let that be an excuse. If God is inviting you to agony now, or if you feel led to ask him to lead you, do it.
Yeah. It's funny too. Well, it's interesting because there's I think that's what happens is you spend a lot of time in prayer and developing that intimacy, but at some point your prayers just kind of shift away from others. And I think you when you start to see like that there are things that God will only do if you ask for it, and a lot of our needs with our neighbors and our family members even, and things like that, we just don't, we're not seeing any fruitfulness or any intervention from God because we're not asking for it. And so, and even I learned this week, this way of praying, like travailing prayer, this like agony, this groaning, it has biblical roots. Obviously David in the Psalms talks about his body just groaning and because he doesn't have words. Jesus does it. Romans Paul 8 talks about all creation is groaning. But that became a really common practice. I just learned this a few weeks ago in the chattel slavery period of America, where these slaves would meet in prayer houses at night, and they wouldn't have, the trauma that they're experiencing, there aren't words. So they're literally groaning like out loud, just their prayers they don't have words for. And they're praying for freedom, for God to come and move. They're praying for others, for their family members that they've been separated from or whatever. And so and that's a tradition that continues, I think, in the Black church in America. But because there's a collective experience of pain there, they can pray in agony for others because of something they've experienced. And I think it goes back to what you had mentioned, which is that we're so disassociated from like suffering. Our lives are built around like the padding that we create for ourselves from pain.
So when we fast
and
go through that suffering, it's even just a tiny bit of, I'm literally identifying with the poor who are fasting today, even though they don't want to, they don't have a choice.
Yeah.
It gives you a greater sense of compassion. Just like how whenever somebody goes through some sort of suffering at our church, our first step is who else has gone through this suffering? Let's put them together. There's something about carrying and bearing the burden together. And so that's really the heartbeat. I also thought it was pretty interesting. I'm always afraid to say names because like tell me things and I never ask, can I share that publicly? So I'll just say someone at the Cultivate conference told me they were thinking about how what fasting does for them. So this was before hearing this contending message, was it prepares them for suffering. So like when suffering does come, it's like, oh, I have been building my endurance up so that when suffering does come, when there is something with my body that isn't working well, I kind of have already built in this endurance. And also she relayed that to when I'm suffering with Christ. Like I'm also identifying with his sufferings that he endured.
Yeah, there's a that kind of is sort of what we're going to talk about on Sunday. This idea of like it seems, and I've said this before, it seems like for the New Testament writers, for the apostles, for Paul and for Peter, when they talk about enduring suffering, even James, consider it pure joy when you endure trials of various kinds. That their take on suffering is that it is as much of a practice as something like prayer, like something you can literally schedule suffering into your like weekly routines via fasting. And what that does is exactly that. That's a great point, that it prepares you for things and it allows
Good job,
God.
Michaela. I'll just say it. It was Michaela. Shout out to Michaela. Keep going.
It allows God to meet you in a way that you wouldn't otherwise allow him to meet you in. And then that pushes you onto others. Scott McKnight has this quote, I put it in the guide. Fasting is body poverty, self-impoverishment as a response to the impoverishment of others. And so it is a way to connect like our bodies, not in like there's a really like snobby way to do this where you can kind of be like, well, I don't know. Anyways.
The first time I fasted was when I thought my grandfather was on his deathbed. So he got a stroke. It was on my birthday, which my birthday is in 2 days. I'm really wondering what you're getting me. Just kidding. You would never, and I would never. It was fine. Anyways, it was on my birthday. It's like my birthday always has something dramatic. So I'm praying this year is just not every year, but anyways. So I was so distraught. This was my hero, and he was undergoing a stroke, and he couldn't eat, and so I just felt. I didn't see it in the Bible. Like I didn't know this. I just was like, I can't eat. If he can't eat, I can't eat. So like in solidarity with him, I didn't have words for this, but I just felt like it was wrong to eat while he couldn't.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the genesis, like there's something there.
Yeah.
And some of us do it naturally, even non-believers. Like I've heard people like at hospitals are like, no, I can't eat. Like it's a way to identify. And for me, it helped me pray for him in deeper ways. It really kept me focused. There's another illustration I never got to share throughout those 3 weeks that I just will say it now. So that's one. My first time fasting was with like I thought he was going to die. The second one, though, that I've been thinking a lot about is fasting helps us contend for our neighbor because it also, going back to week 3, it helps us define reality and it helps us see for what's really true. My kids, for like, I don't know, this was a couple years ago, I was going to my wife and saying, Jordan, I don't know what's going on, but our kids aren't eating because every time it comes to dinner time, they're like, no, I'm not hungry. I'm like, how in the world could they not be hungry? Turns out they've been snacking all day, right? So because of all the snacking, they're not able to get like the real good stuff that's actually good for them. And I think in the same way, there's that connection when we are snacking on the world, and this could be literal food too, but just in general, it keeps us away from what's most important. So I think it when we don't fast, it does keep us from really seeing the world how we should see and really contending, like not, what was the for?
No, it's so weird. I've experienced this very recently, like within this month. And there's no way to say this without sounding like really pretentious and self-righteous. So I'm just going to
your daily struggle.
I know, man. I know. I genuinely, I don't think highly of myself at all.
You don't.
So
I've been trying to work on that with you.
But there is something that happens on the days when I'm not full of food, where I like feel more holy. Like I feel like there is some connection between what I'm putting literally into my body and what I'm also absorbing into my spirit. Like there's I don't have words for it. I don't know what, like, it's not like anything weird happens or anything like that. It's just, I do think that there's a connection between filling your body, your mind, your eyes, whatever, with like the equivalent of junk food, or literally junk food, junk food that like prohibits your ability to like be aware of God throughout the rest of your day. And it's not just like, oh, I have a hunger pang, but I'm fasting, so that reminds me of God. It's more of like, no, my body is like in a pure state in some way because it hasn't been filled with like junk.
Have you felt more emotional?
Generally, yes. Yeah.
I've even noticed, I have not been planning it, but every once in a while I've been crying during my sermons, and I had someone in college where they cried every sermon. So I'm like, okay, that feels so planned.
Yeah.
So I'm always like, nah, that feels manipulative or whatever. But it happens. And I'm like, I think it's because I have just been fasting more.
Mm-hmm.
It really does make you emotional. I remember when my dad was in a 40-day fast, and it was like on day 25, and I was like 12. And he was like crying all day. And I'm like, who are you? You're the cowboy who rides bulls. Like, why are you crying? It's like, I don't know. I'm just emotional.
Yeah.
Like, it's like crazy what it does. But it's like the worst version. It's like the Matrix, where it's just like, oh my gosh, you're actually seeing what's actually literally around us. And it's devastating.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. Exactly what you said last week. It defines reality. And we don't think of it as reality because we're used to the junk food. We're used to the junk, but yeah.
Another illustration's like WALL-E. Like we're just all we can see is the screen right in front of us. We can't even walk anymore. But hey, it's going to keep entertaining us to death.
We avoid
amusing ourselves to death. Neil Postman.
Yeah, the Neil Postman.
Which his intro alone is so good. Neil Postman's introduction and amusing ourselves to death.
Yeah,
keep going.
There's
I think I just said deaf.
You did. It's okay.
That was amazing.
Bring attention to it.
That can happen too, though.
Yeah.
So,
no, yeah, it is a weird thing, and I hope people have been practicing fasting have experienced some of that. But yeah, there is a weird connection between our emotional lives. I think also too, because I'm so I live in my head. I'm really generally detached from my emotions. Moving my body. It's what I said week one. It integrates all of you together. So
yes.
One of my main ideas from week one was, do you want to see what your internal desires are? Look at your external actions and behaviors, the posture of your heart. David says, turn my eyes away from these things so that my heart can look at you. But then the inverse is true. If you want to turn your heart into a new direction, do something with your body, your posture. And so fasting integrates you to where now I'm all of a sudden, so it's not that I'm emotional because I'm hungry, although I'm sure that's some of it. It's that I'm more in tune with my entire being. My whole body is now aware of the pain that I've been carrying from something that I forgot about, or my affections for God are enlivened or something like that. Yeah.
So the takeaway we told people this week was to ask God to move you from sympathy to agony. Number 2, share what you have to those in need. And number 3, pray the promises of God. And so we encourage you even to search the scriptures to pray those promises over people. I do want to ask you this question. And then if you're fine with it, I'd love for us to do a bunch of the questions that we gathered on people's questions people have on fasting.
Yeah.
My question though is, in your mind, is this the way we taught it? Is that like step 1, 2, 3, and 4? Like, is there some sort of logic to that? I know, like we thought to some degree, but you get what I'm saying? So week 1 to week 4, is it helpful to go through that progression from that?
Yeah, I think so. I think week 1 was just don't eat, choose a day and just try it. And then don't worry about prayer for a specific thing or anything. Just
learn
practice,
to say no.
Just practice saying no. Even if it's just one meal this week or something like that. So I think that's a really helpful way to start. I think week 2 was kind of teaching you what to do instead. So pay attention to God more, like repurpose that time. Week 3 was, okay, by now you're probably becoming aware of like the discomfort. So yeah, I think it is a helpful progression and it does stack. But then eventually, like I think once you kind of practice each focus, they kind of mix if you integrate fasting into your regular
this stuff always, right?
So some days you'll fast and there's something very specific you're holding before God in prayer. Other days you'll fast and you're just like, I just want to be more aware of you.
Yeah.
Other days you fast and you're like, I don't want to pray. I don't want to fast today.
But you
I'm
did
gonna
the
do it.
discipline of saying no.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes where it's like, all I did was still say no to food. Well, like, thank you, Lord.
Yeah.
I know I need to do.
I actually had a worse day today
Right.
because I fasted, but I trust that I'm offering this
It was
to you.
better
God,
than
and-
having snacks all day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, man. Oh, I think Isaiah 58 too. I think in context, you could argue these people were doing it day after day after day, and God was calling them to contend for their neighbor. I mean, that was clear. I mean, you read all of Isaiah. I mean, that's not the first time God brings up the poor and the injustice and all of that. So I think too, it becomes disobedience and it becomes a fast that God is not a part of. If he has been prompting you, okay, we're at this level. You've learned to say no. Wonderful. You've been saying yes, a deeper union. You're even confessing your own needs. You got to broaden your horizons. You need to contend for your neighbor. And if we go, no, I'm good. I enjoy this practice of how fulfilling it feels. He'll be God, in his mercy is like, I'm not doing this anymore, because it's always leading towards loving your neighbor. Do you disagree?
No, I think that the end, like the sort of macro level end goal though, is even beyond like the days where you're specifically contending for your neighbor. I think it's more an issue of, and I think contextually too in Isaiah 58, the matter isn't so much like what you're focusing on when you're fasting. So fasting for the purpose of contending for your neighbor is a great way to get you to the end goal, which is, even when I am denying myself, it's so that I can be formed into a person who is able to say no to other desires, even on days when I'm not fasting, so that I can bless someone else. Like the end goal is always just to be a kind of person who's oriented towards others in like a self-sacrificial way. And so, yes, contending for your neighbor is a great like way to get that into your bones, and focusing on that, making that a feature of your fasts often will get you here. But I think even in Isaiah 58, the end goal is like, you even in verse 6, break the chains of wickedness, untie the ropes of the yoke, set the oppressed free, share your bread with the hungry, bring the poor and homeless into your house. Like, it's not so much like, are you practicing these things? I think it's like, are you this kind of people? Will my people fast and then allow themselves in their fasting to be formed like this? So yeah, I think. Yeah.
I just really love Jesus's application of that in Matthew 25. And I really think a takeaway from Matthew 25, because he is saying those who are with me and those who are not, like this is the sheep and the goats. This is on the left and the right. And the takeaway is, if you love God, you will love your neighbor. And if you actually genuinely love your neighbor, it's because you genuinely love God. There is no separating. So I did that graph as like an example, but ultimately you have to throw that graph away, because there is no loving God while hating your neighbor, And so, but I still did it to like help give some context. And I think we can slip into these things, but to genuinely love God is to genuinely love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And that connection God makes over and over throughout the biblical text, the whole story.
Yeah.
Okay. Question time.
Yeah.
Can we go back and forth?
Sure.
Or are you just the answer machine?
I can answer. I can make up an answer to anything.
I feel like some of these we've addressed though. So like, should we do every single one, or should we just kind of popcorn through it?
I'll let you start.
Okay. How long should I fast? Is there a recommended duration for beginners?
It depends on what you're comfortable with. I would say try 1 meal a day. If that feels too easy, go to 2 meals a day. If that feels too easy, then maybe do like 2 days a week. I find for me right now, 2 days a week is like a challenging but doable. I think that's the balance. You want something challenging, but also doable. Like you're relying on the grace of God, but you're also not like killing yourself.
So to be clear, you don't have anything the entire day, and that's day one. And is it 2 days in a row, or you're not eating on Tuesday at all ever? Wednesday you're eating and then not eating at all, or whatever?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, I do Tuesday dinner to Wednesday dinner. So it's a full 24 hours from dinner to dinner. And then again, Thursday dinner to Friday dinner. So a full 24 hours dinner to dinner. But that's just what I do.
So like, this is to help, because I've noticed people ask this question. So you ate at 5 o'clock on Tuesday. You're not going to eat again until 5 o'clock on Wednesday, or you're saying you didn't eat dinner on Tuesday?
No, I ate dinner on Tuesday.
Exactly.
Let's say I eat dinner Tuesday night at like 5 or 6. Maybe I'll have a snack at like 8 or something like that. But then I'm not eating till at least like, I always eat with my group on Wednesdays. So that breaks my fast. Is usually 6:30. If we're running late, 6:45, 7, something like that.
Cool. And to add to that, there's all sorts of different examples. There's 40 days, there's 3 days, there's 1 day. We also believe in the Great Tradition. So we also look to church history, not as our authority, but it does help us, and we try to take wisdom from our heroes of the faith. And so we described it as cadence and crisis. So we think there's something about the cadence of twice a week that we've seen throughout history, and God used those types of people. But also you see the Pharisee fasting twice a week, and he's very far from God because he doesn't love his neighbor. But then it's in crisis where it's like, okay, something's happened, or man, we really need to make a decision. And so you do a prolonged fast for that. All right, you do the next question.
Let's talk about abstaining. What if I have health conditions that make fasting difficult? We've kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I don't know if we've...
Yeah, I don't know where that question was, but I'm just going to roll. I'm trying to make sure I don't... Okay, I see it. Yeah, we actually have Victoria. She brand new, has a brand new baby, and she was like, I hate that I can't fast because I literally can't. And so she's been abstaining twice a week, all day. For her, it's from her video games. Like, she's a big gamer. And so there is, I think, definitely room for that. I think there's people who have a really unhealthy relationship with food, and the worst thing they can do is to keep not eating. Some people need to eat more. And so that's why we say consult your doctor, and you know, there's obviously times and spaces, and you might not be in the season to be able to abstain from food. So, but we would say, okay, great, to keep in step with understanding our Bibles well and with the Great Tradition. If you are abstaining from social media, call it abstaining from social media. Don't call it fasting from social media. And so abstaining is a huge practice, and I believe you're going to be talking about that a little bit this Sunday, because Lent, some people take it as this is a 40-day fast, and you can get creative. It's like, if you've never, still new to this, it's fasting from breakfast or it's fasting from lunch, you know? So for me, my plan is to eat dinner every day. But for some people, though, it's like, okay, that was a lot. I'm still learning this. For the 40 full days, though, I'm going to abstain. And I would say it's not abstaining like, oh, I'm abstaining. I mean, I don't know. I guess there's grace. But it gets silly when it's like from Diet Coke. Like, I'll have Coke, but not Diet Coke, or what, you know, we can begin
Chick-fil-A,
to...
not In-N-Out.
Yeah, exactly. So you do you. I remember in junior high, I did fast, and I fasted from desserts.
Yeah.
And wow, it was transformative. So there's something to that. I think it's more, if you're going to abstain, it's about your attention. So that goes back to our simplicity practice. What an amazing thing if our people for 40 days stopped watching all things media and just use that time to pray and to focus on people right in front of them and just be more fruitful with their time. That alone would be incredible. So there's all sorts of ways to abstain.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think, that's helpful. Traditionally, fasting is very specific. And then even with Lent, when it started, the early church would, they would only eat vegetables for dinner. So no meat. So
I also want to throw out, from my studies, I don't think it should be called the Daniel fast.
Right.
It's a Daniel diet, which is great, but like, he's still eating. He
Yeah.
was just being specific with his food. But branding wise, Daniel fast sounds cooler. But it's not necessarily, that's kind of a new phrase.
Yeah, it's a new integration of holistic discipleship, things like that. Yeah,
and there's some healthy things to do that, like not to discourage it.
Well, I'm even thinking of
but
like
words matter.
Even like the days, it loses a little bit of potency, and this is where you can get really self-righteous. And I tend to be really intense personally with how I like to practice these things. So this is just me, but like if I fast all day and then I have like In-N-Out for dinner, like I feel bad, like
Really
icky. I also feel like I've done like,
what about the concept of feasting?
so feasting for me is not like fast food. The fast food is like convenient, and I know it's gonna like somewhat satisfy me, but not nourish me. So what I'm after is like real nourishment. And I think like I love the idea of eating, and I'm not great at this either, but I love the idea of like there has to be some correlation between like clean eating and like your spiritual life or something. I don't know. So,
at the very least, it's better for your body.
Yeah, something like that.
So is fasting a requirement for Christians?
Technically, no. Yeah, man, that's it. I've always struggled answering these kinds of questions. Like, do I have to practice Sabbath? What's the most I can get away with?
Where's your heart when you're asking those questions?
I think, I think that there's You don't have to do it. No, I think that what it does, if your end goal is union with Christ, which I would define as salvation, like that is, we are one with Christ, but already we're justified, all of that. But if the promise is that we will be more one with Christ and we will look more like Christ, and that part of salvation is like the healing of the parts of us that aren't formed like Christ. So if that's what you want, if that's your end goal, then I think at some point in your life, you will want to fast as a means to that end. But if that is not your end goal, if you don't want to be one with Christ and you don't want to be formed into his image and you don't want to rid yourself of the flesh that's keeping you from that salvation and that healing, then I would say you've probably misunderstood what the gospel is. You've probably misunderstood what Jesus came to do. And we should have a conversation about that.
Yeah, I think the reason why I say it's not required, Jesus says when you fast, not you have to fast.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a requirement for salvation, but it is a discipline to grow closer to God. So we always give that caveat. But one thing I think we tried to dispel all month long is the didache.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going on your team.
Thank you.
Not didache. The didache was like, oh, you just got saved? Cool, let's fast. Like, it's not just reserved for the pros.
Mm-hmm.
So that's us trying to also be in solidarity with church history. That it's, I think, a lie from the enemy that like, oh, only the super experts fast. And
Yes.
There's no way I can do that.
Yeah.
Next question.
Oh, right. I forget it.
Should you do that one, or can you see me highlight?
You ask me this every time you highlight something on Notion. Every time.
See the TV next to it, the little bubble.
No, I don't see your cursor at all. I think we're on
What
different.
are the emotional questions on the Formed by Fasting?
Yeah.
Page
Okay.
decorated?
What if I fail and break my fast? Is God disappointed in me?
That's not the one I wanted you to ask, but
You created several different Notions, and I think I'm on the old or the new
no,
one.
that's the third question. I wanted you to ask the first one. No, this is great though.
Well, then you ask the
What if
first
I
one.
fail and break my fast? Is God disappointed in me? That's a good question, Pastor Caleb. No, I actually think that's a wonderful opportunity to experience his grace, to go boldly before his throne. We can so quickly view fasting as making ourselves more precious to God, but the heartbeat of fasting is making God more precious to us. And so one paradigm that helps us in all the practices is we're not trying to behave like Jesus, we're training to become like Jesus, or we're not trying to perform for Jesus, we're training to be formed by Jesus. And so there is grace upon grace. We it's usually you probably fail in your fast because you went too hardcore too soon. So this is why you said start with 1 meal and then to 2. It's the marathon analogy. You're not going to tomorrow run a half marathon, or even or definitely not a full. You'll be going to the hospital. It's what's a 5K look like, or what does 1 mile look like? And so there's grace, and we have to remember that God is so patient and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And he wants us not, I don't think he's looking, unless there's like a crisis, but this general, you say this all the time, I think it's helpful. Consistency is way better than intensity. So what can you consistently do, and how can you grow and build on that? But this is none of the practices are something where if you failed it, it's not a performance. So you can't even really look that way. At the same time, if you are actually like not fasting and telling people you are, that's a whole nother conversation, like, oh, I killed it. And like literally you haven't even tried. It's like, now you're lying, and you're deceiving, and you're doing it to pretend for your neighbor. Or I do think a way to fast that you need to repent from is if you're fasting to condemn your neighbor, using the analogy we use Sunday. So if you are fasting to look down on others, you have failed it, and you have kind of broken God's heart in that sense. But if
I think it's also, there's a tendency to, if you break your fast too early, or if you fail or whatever, it's one thing if you forget, like that's happened to me before, where like early on I'll start a fast and I forget that I'm fasting, and someone will invite me to lunch and I'll be like, yeah, sure. And I go to lunch and I'm like, oh man, I forgot I'm fasting.
and that's another rule people have, where it's like, I'm fasting, but if somebody like goes out of their way and makes me something, it's like, okay, I'm not going to be a jerk. I'm just going to say thank you and eat it and be like, Lord, you understand.
So that's one thing, that just sort of negligence, like I just forgot, is one thing. But if there's if you're struggling, like if you're home all day, you're struggling, and you like start snacking at like 11 a.m. or something like that, Yes, definitely grace upon grace. And I don't think God is disappointed or anything like that. But I do think that is an opportunity. God is maybe inviting you to like examine something. Like look at what were you doing right before this? What mental state are you in? What emotional state are you in? What is drawing you to do this? Like, what is it? Because I think that's the thing that you need to offer to God.
Yes.
It's not so much the fasting. It's the like what it's uncovering.
And discern that in community. Don't be asking these questions all alone, trying to figure it out. Let your group process this with you. Let us as pastors help you.
Yeah.
The next question is, should I tell others I'm fasting? Isn't it supposed to be private?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because people take the Matthew 6 teaching from Jesus on fasting. When you fast, wash your hair, wash your face, so that your Father who sees you in secret will reward you in secret, which is really interesting because there is a reward.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. But then people take that idea and they say like, oh, Jesus is telling us to be really private and we should never do something like a corporate fast. You should never tell anybody you're fasting. And I think that misses the point. I think Jesus is giving us a very practical way to counteract the compulsion that we all feel to like highlight our piety to others. The sort of like Instagrammable, like self-righteousness that's so easy. So I think that you definitely don't like boast about it, but throughout scriptures, there are communal fasts and that's really obvious that
Be
people
awkward
people
in Acts
knew
13 if no.
Yeah.
We're fasting, but I'm not, we're fasting together, which is
Yeah.
what our church has been doing. Because people have said, I just don't want to talk about it in group. It's like, well, this is a communal fast. This is really the point, and that's okay.
So much of the Sermon on the Mount, which is where Jesus' teaching comes from, thank you, is about the heart issue. And I think we point to things like when he teaches on lust and say like, no, he's actually talking about the heart issue. But I think that's the case here as well, is they say, oh, it's the heart issue that Jesus is actually concerned by. Are you bringing attention to yourself, or are you sharing to edify your community?
Yes. Time for one more question. Do we have one?
Just one more. Oh man, these are good ones.
We're definitely not on the same doc, but keep going. No, yeah, you are.
I am. Yeah.
I just don't see your cursor, so maybe that isn't.
I'm not. I don't know where my cursor is. Are you highlighting the one you want me to ask?
No, I'm not touching anything now.
Okay.
What's the question?
I'm looking for. I mean, some of these I feel like we've answered.
I know.
I don't know. Some of these are really good. Okay, I'm gonna. I don't know the answer to this one.
Just go.
Okay. Does fasting guarantee God will answer my prayers?
I knew you were going to ask that one.
Well, it was that one or what's the difference between fasting in the Old Testament and the New Testament, which is a really interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer.
I know, me neither.
I kind of have an answer. I could riff on that, but
Fucking riff. Riff away.
I would figure it out as I started
Yeah.
rambling.
Yeah. Well, the Holy Spirit inside of us, that's step one, right? Like that helps.
Yeah, that helps. Oh, that's a great point. Oh, in the Old Testament, their fasting wasn't empowered by the Spirit. In the New Testament, in theory, they're fasting with the Spirit. Yeah, I think in the Old Testament, there's a more of a corporate element to it in the sense of like fasting is usually a response to pain. And in the New Testament, it seems to be more of a habit or a practice.
Yeah, in the New Testament, it does seem to be more about guidance, about what's next.
Discerning the will of God. That's something we
Yes.
haven't talked about much, is the correlation between fasting and then discerning God's will.
Well, that's why I said it defines your future reality. So I talked about it a little bit.
Okay, cool.
Thanks for listening.
Wasn't listening.
I'm pretty sure you spaced out in that one because you've said, last podcast, you're like, what do you mean define reality? I'm like, I spent 15 minutes on it. Anyways, things are going well with us. Does fasting guarantee God will answer my prayer? So great question, Pastor Caleb. So the reality is going back to the paradigm we shared last week, the answer will be rescue, refine, or resurrect. And it will always be resurrect.
Yeah.
So it's very possible for us to have the wrong answer in our mind that we want, but we submit our will to his. And so I believe if fasting is done with the right heart, there is something about the scriptures that show it does seem to align our will with his. it does seem, I heard somebody say recently, the first step actually, when you see people praying for revival, is they don't just say, hey, God, give us revival. They actually search the scriptures, and they're fasting going, God, what do you want us to pray for? So that's the step before the step is first, God, define this reality. What is on your heart? And then I'm going to lean into that more. David Thomas, he recently said in a message, he says, when God hears his heart in our voice, that's when he moves. And so I think it's studying his heart in the scriptures. Then we can line our will with his. And then he says, right, like ask whatever you want, it'll be given to you. But the context is, are you abiding in his word? Are you aligning your heart with his? So yes, I have had fasts where it wasn't the answer I wanted. But trusting his overall will and sovereignty and goodness, it was the answer that I needed, or God used it to glorify himself and to ultimately bring me joy. So it's an interesting question because it kind of puts you in a box. So I'm trying to step out of that box a little bit.
Yeah, but I also, and I apologize if you mentioned this last week and I just wasn't listening. I imagine you did.
I gave you the transcript and you heard it twice.
And I wrote a guide based on it.
Yeah.
And I think I wrote the overview. So I definitely read it.
I'm encouraged. Keep going.
In Mark 9, did you talk about this? I think it's in Mark 9. There's a demon the disciples can't cast out, and Jesus has
this can only be taken out with fasting and prayer?
With prayer and fasting. You can only get rid of this demon by prayer and fasting, which is a really weird thing to say, and seems to indicate that there might be. And it's hard. You don't want to base a whole theology off of one little thing, so I want to be careful. But it seems as if there might be some prayers that maybe God wouldn't answer unless it was prayer coupled with fasting.
I think Jesus kind of makes that clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of the A.W. Tozer quote. Let me read that. I never got to say it. See, this is the hard part about making it into just
4 weeks.
4 weeks sometimes. But the joy is we can come back around later. But Andrew Murray says this way: prayer needs fasting for its full growth. Prayer is the one hand with which we grasp the invisible. Fasting is the other hand, the one with which we let go of the visible. Mm-hmm. It's such a word. He continues, and it's really long. But then he goes on to say, fasting helps to express, to deepen, and to confirm the resolution that we are ready to sacrifice anything, even ourselves, to attain the kingdom of God. There's a lot of that language about fasting, kind of like the two wings analogy that Augustine used, but he said fasting and almsgiving. But yes, Jesus says that. Like, and again, where you don't want to go off on it is if does fasting make you more righteous? No, but there does seem to be an anointing. A book we're both reading, I read this morning, how one way to really put yourself in that posture and allow God to use you is to be in a state of fasting. So this is not salvific. We're not using that category. But there is something about the power and anointing of God on your life when you are in a state of fasting.
Yeah.
With the right heart.
To answer it, no, it doesn't guarantee God will answer your prayers, but there are prayers that God might not have otherwise answered if you don't also fast.
Look at Isaiah 58, 8-10. He's saying, man, if you fast in this way, I will bring light in this darkness. I will be at your rear guard. I will bring but you need to have the right posture and do it for the sake of others. And so the challenge that we are now fully embarking on at Passion Creek is to empower our people. My mentor always calls it, actually, it's not spiritual formation, it's being formissional, because it's formation for the sake of mission. I was on a roll here, now I'm messing myself up. Robert Mulholland, his definition of formation is always for the sake of others. So we're going to really be pressing our people throughout the rest of this year, using all of this, not just for Project Self, not to believe in the lies of suburbia that we need to build up a fortress and feel good about ourselves and comfort and personal affluence and personal peace, as Francis Schaeffer said, but fasting for the sake of the least of these, for our neighbor, for the lost, for the weary, for the sick, for the oppressed.
One question I have, that if we have time to get your thought on, and we could both answer, but like, what would this look like if somebody's wondering, like, should I keep fasting after this? Like, what does it look like to have this kind of a rhythm? Like, how often do you have a season where, like, okay, I'm fasting? Because I think for a lot of people, still fasting is like just a response. When you talk about a cadence, like after this practice, and then maybe even after Lent, what would that look like for you? How often would you continue a regular practice of fasting?
Yeah.
What's the
I
hope
love
for our
that.
people?
Yeah, the hope. So to say what we said in January, what we've been trying to do is create a theology, a template, and a trial run. So we try to address the theology both in January about self-control, but also you did a good job that first week, the theology of fasting, of the body, and of desire. And then we've been trying to create this template. How do you build, what does fasting look like in your life? And so hopefully by the end of these 4 weeks, you at least have some sort of grasp of what a template of what fasting could look like when you want to fast. We're considering these next Lent to be our trial run. Like really see, okay, we tried this for a month. What happens if we did this for 2 more months? How can we begin to make this a full-on habit? So that's really our desire. If you're talking ideal, I would love to go in step with the great tradition, and we have like 25% of our people fasting twice a week. Like how incredible would that be? Mm-hmm. Or people fasting once a month. Like every, first Thursday of the month, I'm just fasting from sunrise to sundown. It's just what a great cadence to create posture to make space for God's grace. It's not removal to get approval, but making space for God's grace. So I love that idea of crisis, fasting in crisis. And I think, there will be times where we tell our church, hey, we need to fast for discernment, for wisdom, for on behalf of the sick. But we're also hoping, while we're talking about everything else, we're gently reminding our people to make it a cadence. What's your answer?
Yeah, I would say, I would consider it a win if people after Lent and even like into the summer, end of the year, whatever, consider some habitual form of fasting, just as they would consider, like, it's really hard. Some of the practices like peacemaking is kind of hard to do on a weekly basis to habituate, to like put in your calendar. But something like Sabbath, prayer, scripture reading, and fasting, I think if you like are doing those consistently and allowing that to form you, however you define consistently, I think my hope would be that people would somehow integrate fasting into a regular weekly or monthly rhythm.
And here's where we're honestly hitting. This is where I love our framework that we have for discipleship at formed-by-jesus.com. I also understand how overwhelming to try to do online practices all the time. So this is a conversation you and I are constantly having moving forward. We're hoping we create such fully formed followers of Christ that are pulled away from the third soil and truly becoming the fourth, that all 9 are in the tool belt and we're doing, but also recognizing that, that we're all training, we're all at different ages and stages. So fasting does look different, but we're just hoping you're doing some sort of fasting. Now, Sabbath, I feel like there's a little less freedom. It's like, to me, it just seems like if you can get the 24 hours, that seems to be the thing. But the freedom is which day of the week and all of that. So yeah, that's kind of where there's grace. Our hope is that we become the type of people where all of these things happen, but we also know reality. So I don't know.
We need to talk about a rule of life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, a rule, regula, a way of life. You like rule.
I do. Redeem it. Redeem the word.
Redeem it. All right, what's the word today?
Regula.
It can't be, okay, regula. Regula is I also had them comment at the very beginning, communication. So let's see what they say.
Oh yeah, if they want a workshop. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Grace and peace, everybody.